I'm happy to welcome on stage Cynthia Liem. She's from she's professor from Delft University of Technology. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. So as for me, in terms of my background, a bit of an unusual thing, I'm a concert pianist. But next to that, I have been trained as a computer scientist. And the reason I'm still here and became an academic is even thanks to nobody else than Google. Because when the world digitalized, I got interested in how to filter these large digital collections and archives, and especially how to surface things that are less obviously on the radar. That wasn't something in the Netherlands I could easily get funding for back then, because it was culture which wasn't deemed important enough economically. But Google actually gave me a doctoral fellowship, and that's why I'm still here. I spent some time there as an intern, but I did return back to the Netherlands because I felt we needed also some alternatives in the more public sector. And from music, from culture, I've done several interdisciplinary projects, including some regarding labor market applications, of which I will talk today mostly. But maybe relevant to also mention is that since a year or two, I've been also quite visible in the Dutch public sphere as one of the people with a technical background who, however, in media are commenting about AI and digitalization. So a bit more than 2 years ago, I was the first commenter on the risk model underlying the childcare benefit scandal, which was a large human rights violation in the Netherlands that had some algorithmic discrimination component to it. And ever since, I've worked quite a bit in that space, now broader in responsible and trustworthy AI, and it did shape a lot of my thinking today. So even though I'm less visible on that as an academic, I feel it's maybe relevant in this context to mention that too. So what I'm interested in, I told you already, it's basically this idea that humans are confronted with too much information, and then somehow as a consequence they can't go through all, so somehow their attention should be narrowed down to things that typically are deemed relevant. That's the classical frame we use in search and in recommendation. What I'm interested in is, however, this. What is not obviously relevant, what things are that people did not all massively go click on, I'm not convinced that's necessarily the logical complement to that it's necessarily irrelevant. However, to get that in the picture is way more difficult because you don't have signal on that and people are not as inclined to it, so it's way harder to optimize for it. But that's been really something I was interested in, whether it's about media or in these HR applications, maybe about people that get selected for opportunities. And what also interests me in this space, and I think we touched upon it indirectly in many of the talks today, is that really there are a lot of underlying methodological schools of thought playing here. I'm a computer scientist. The question even is to what extent computer science is a science, or maybe an engineering discipline, or maybe a mix of it all. It also has some design to it. I would argue it's a bit of everything. But if you think of how these schools classically more in the pillared sense have evolved, science has been having a strong physical tradition in which you make measurements of the world in a natural space, you have sensors, and by the laws of nature you know when something is true. Engineers, they build things, they construct things in a clever way. It doesn't necessarily have to be completely physically accurate as long as the thing works. And that is a different success criterion. Designers craft something, it's a bit like engineering in an ingenious way. Maybe it can also be nice or aesthetic or smart there. So even here, the criteria for that are slightly different. Then there are social sciences and humanities having their own traditions of truths and things they're looking for that might not always match. And me, myself, of course, being an artist, being a musician, even there, what as an artist I might find meaningful, I might not always manage selling off as a quantitative computer scientist working in the applied machine learning domain. So even there, I think those truths can exist next to one another if we're clear on how we are looking at it. But many of these current societal impact discussions, I would say, are a bit in the blur between it all, and that also makes it quite difficult. So what I'm mostly going to speak about today are experiences from a past also European project. I mean, it's nice to hear about the BIAS project. I'm happy that you're there and getting started. We had a project called Big Data in Psychological Assessment, which was an Erasmus Plus project. So it was formally meant for education innovation. I was asked to collaborate on that by colleagues in organizational psychology. They were concerned about discrimination in hiring. They'd done some research into video resumes. And what they at least had seen was that the people who would be discriminated against in textual CVs, because their names would sound foreign, felt at least more comfortable with the idea they could maybe self-present in a video. At least you saw the person, and you see the person is of certain backgrounds, but they at least felt I can more authentically now present and don't have to fit in something I will easily not fit into. And then they approached me and said, like, could AI and machine learning maybe help here? Can we have a more impartial, objective, distanced thing looking along and doing these selections? Because we know that humans are biased. So can this be something to work on? And that led to a lot of interesting discussions, a lot of vocabulary clashes too. Because one of the first things striking me was that we were really imprecise in what we were speaking about. And algorithms, machine learning, AI, robots, it was just used interchangeably. It still is being used interchangeably in the public discussion. No fixing it. It's just how we have to deal with this. But it, again, does make it very challenging to figure out what you're speaking about. And in this talk, I mostly want to share the confusion that happened there with you, because again, we might learn from that. So if we speak about making decisions based on data in this space, and say it's candidate selection, we have a lot of candidates, we want to hire someone, we cannot hire all of them, who do we pick? What seems to be the common pipeline between my organizational psychology colleagues and me was that we had a pipeline that kind of looked like this. There was some phenomenon that was being measured, and we had data that led to variables for which a statistical model was ran on it, and then we had some output. The only thing that I realized much later in the process was that we looked at different aspects of this pipeline. My colleagues typically were interested in these outer parts. What leads to an indicator of job performance? What is an indicator of job performance in the first place? They were interested in their figuring out, like, should I use other input data? Normally they would do intelligence tests or so, or personality tests. Might there be things more data-driven? Could we infer something from a video? And there, I'm not sure if there are social scientists in this room, something very important to them was psychometrics. Because they said we are measuring what they called constructs, things that we cannot directly measure by putting a sensor on a physical phenomenon. Something like personality. We want to know whether someone is open. You can't put a thermometer on the person and then say whether the person is open. You have to ask the person, it's indirect, and you have to do it in such a way that your measurement, that the instrument you use for the measurement is valid and reliable. This is something classically in social sciences methodology that people get in their bachelor's there. It's something I never got as a computer scientist because I was always taught that machine learning happens on flower petals, where this isn't an issue. So that was very clarifying to me that indeed, whether we actually measure the thing we think we measure, to me it was much less specified than to them. And what you, even in organizational practice, you also see this issue. They complained a lot about things like the Myers-Briggs personality inventory being super popular in HR, which has been proven to not be valid nor reliable. It's very friendly, people recognize themselves in it, but it doesn't replicate. It's not something that is a valid measurement, even though it's super popular. Now, the hard thing is that, again, if we are data scientists, computer scientists, we just get data. We typically only get numbers. And we cannot really verify the distinction on whether this is something that's legit or not, or often we don't even care if we only look at accuracy. So that was an important translational difference between us. And as for that, again, these psychologists were looking at, is this something I can trust? So maybe in that middle part, I don't have to hit the button in SPSS that I normally do. That was what they were interested in, because normally they model some linear regression typically, and then try to explain. Now, me as a machine learning expert, I would typically focus on optimizing for that and indeed not do something like the classical SPSS button, but maybe a fancier technique to predict. But on the condition that these outer parts are stable so I can fit on them. So what we realized after a while was that, wait, we look at the same pipeline, but we don't actually trust, or we shouldn't actually trust the part that we would normally think we would trust in order to be able to proceed. So I was realizing, wait, you're not sure if this data is predictive, and they were like, wait, but we were thinking that you can predict things in a better way than humans. Also, the data was very different in nature. If you think of video resumes, you would think of raw multimedia going in there, not something like an intelligence test that speaks to persons in a human-filtered way and has them filling surveys. And raw multimedia, that's just a lot of numbers. Just this portrait image, it's a lot of pixels. It's a 224 by 224 image, but it's 150,000 plus intensity values if you think of the red, the green, and the blue channel. And I can't even put it on the slide, how it looks. This is just the upper part, red, green, and blue. So as for that, back in the days, when I was also trained as an applied signal processing person, we spoke about the semantic gap. That was something in the early 2000s that we were concerned about, that what we observe as human beings is very far away from the raw signal presentation. So if you would just get that representation and you have that picture of mine and these pictures to the right, the closest picture in that raw representation space is the picture of my duo partner who was with me on the same stage when the picture was taken. Because in terms of color balance, those distributions are closest. Not all the pictures of me. And the interesting thing is, back in the days we were concerned about it because computationally we couldn't handle this. Today we hardly speak about it anymore because we had deep learning and end-to-end setups, so we don't care because we typically get the right answer. But maybe in these types of contexts we should care, because there I was then starting these discussions with my colleagues on what in the video do you want for me to model or use or maybe throw away because you think it's irrelevant. And they couldn't really articulate because they had thought, obviously, there were humans in this video. I was like, well, it's not obvious. You have to tell the computer where to look. And then also this question comes of what is data in the first place. They had carefully, with their students, curated a data set of, it was about 200 videos of properly assessed self-representations in all kinds of different formats, some edited, some not. I couldn't do anything with it as a computer scientist doing machine learning because, again, I was like, should I care about videos being edited? Should I care about background details? If people are filming in their rooms, do we want to take it along or do we think that's privacy intrusive? And again, they hadn't thought of that. They just thought these are a lot of people who present and that are going to be assessed. At the same time, on the other hand, in the big data space, I wouldn't argue that data was better. There was bigger data in a more standardized way from the computer vision community that claimed to use personality, the ocean model. Big five: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. This has been a representation of personality that's been deemed valid and reliable if you administer the proper survey for it. There have been a few inventories proposed for that, longer and shorter, that have been tested with different populations and shown to be stable enough. And there, like when you also would administer an exam as a teacher, again, for each of these dimensions, you should ask the question a few times in different forms to make sure you're actually measuring the thing. So if you have questions about openness, you're not asking, are you open? But you ask a few characterizations associated with openness, coded in two different directions, also the positive or the negative to the both sides. So really, if someone doesn't pay attention so well, you're sure that actually you get enough signal to make sure that this is an indicator of that particular dimension. What that big data set had was crowdsourced work. They claimed to have these 5 dimensions, but it was acquired through this interface, where there was just one item per dimension that we didn't manage tracing back to any of the formal inventories on personality, where also 2 videos were rated at the same time. And the preference was given to whom of the 2 had more of this thing. So who was more friendly, who was more authentic, who was more organized, more comfortable, and more imaginative. Also all the positive characterizations to one side. So to us it felt like, okay, this is an interface that will lead to biased annotations. And I had discussions on this with my colleagues who had collected that. And they were like, no, but the inter-rater agreement was really high. Yes, because it's bias that everyone recognizes. So if we looked at the extreme scores on it, we did feel that people who were a bit more on the margins of society had very low scores here. But yeah, for prediction, it's great. You can get more than 90% accuracy repredicting what came out of this annotation interface. So that's again where you have a bit of this tension between something big you can very well predict for, but of which no sane psychologist would ever accept that type of data. And it's typically not reported also in the technical work following from this, because we get this data and then just go on with this. So I already alluded to this discussion. My colleagues were then a bit sad, and they said, but AI can do better than humans, can't it? And then I had to tell to them, like, well, yes, if you formulate what you're supposed to want to get at. We do supervised learning still in this space. We have to show the examples of what we need. So if you don't trust your human, you shouldn't use this as data that goes into prediction, or you should tell your model to not do the same thing. I'll come back to that later. Before I do that, I'll quickly also zoom into another more recent work of us that I did with a master student of mine. And it is to appear any moment now. It's supposed to be in the April edition of the Proceedings on Human-Computer Interaction, I think, the CSCW journal. So that links a bit to the previous discussion we had, that there is this whole body of research on mathematical fairness, its definitions, its notions, how to optimize. And it seemed to us this doesn't land so much yet in practice. At least there is an academic bubble doing a lot of work on it. And then there is, for example, the HR reality and the diversity and inclusion reality that speak a lot about similar terms, but don't quite meet. And we were thinking that maybe these mathematical fairness notions, they're very clearly defined, they're consistently implementable. They might have these advantages of sticking to a very maybe over-principled way of looking at things, but at least you're clear about what you're doing. Where much about what's now happening in this space, more from a strategic viewpoint, is very abstract and vague, and there isn't clear accountability on it. So my students did a qualitative study with 17 organizational professionals, people in HR, people in DEI, into figuring out whether they could understand some of these mathematical fairness notions in the first place, because we never discussed at that level with them. And also to see to what extent these notions were understandable, deemed fair, deemed having potential to increase diversity, and would be deemed practically applicable in the context of these professionals, in the context of early candidate selection. So our frame was, you have a lot of candidates, you can only proceed with a few of them, you're not yet having to pick one, but you have to, zoom in to a certain pool of applicants. Are any of these definitions that may be useful for you? And we took certain, we didn't manage doing all dozens, of course, but we had 5 of them, some group, some individual, that we looked at. Now again, I don't have time for very detailed discussions, but to show a bit how we did it, we also reframed this idea of the early candidate selection and the historical data, where typically also in historical data, we only know who got invited, and then maybe whether they were good, at least for the ones that we took in our job. We don't really know what happened to the rest. So modeling the ones that weren't chosen as negative examples would to us be too much. You really only know more data on the people you actually selected if you monitored them. So that was already where in the framing, in the coloring, and showing whether this was good or not, we chose for neutral rather than no. And like, we like this person, but we don't yet know whether this is the top candidate. And we try to have these discussions, like not showing the mathematical formulas, but rather having worked examples, like say you have a pool and you have these types of fractions, then these people would have made it. In terms of conclusions, just quickly going over them again, do read the paper as soon as it comes out. First of all, there was not any fairness notion that emerged as the most suitable for this. So there wasn't necessarily one equation of which everyone said that is it, which we had expected, but it's at least good to confirm that also. Also interesting that the considerations of fairness and diversity didn't actually really seem to go hand in hand. We did see a lot of feedback on this would be fair and likely not help diversity. It had a lot to do also with the more individual fairness notions, that if you have equal, say you have gender disbalance and equal suitability of 2 individuals that are of the different genders that you have, you'd have to take them both in some definitions, which would be the most fair thing, typically not practical if you only have one position, but it also would perpetuate the imbalance you already had. And that was something we had these discussions on, like, okay, that's fair in terms of procedure, but it doesn't help you in terms of your bigger picture. Also, there were a lot of concerns on us flattening the discussion, of course, when we went to this mathematical framing. There was a lot of, this is not how it works in practice. Again, we had expected that, but it was interesting to start that discussion and see them saying, no, it's way more complicated than that. But at the same time, on the other hand, also trying to help them understanding that their side of the discussion also was not structured still at this moment. So we started some interesting conversations there. Also, our N was very small, so I can't say this with statistical confidence, but we did seem to see that minoritized groups had some specific different stances on how to improve diversity. They generally seemed, more strongly reacting to some of these cases, sometimes also refusing to cooperate, like this is not how it should work. But also we're quite a bit more skeptical on whether this would help the organization. And again, I'm happy that your project is trying to look at these people, because they're very often not on the table when these design decisions are made. And then finally, well, again, this is not that surprising, but definitely a fairness notion is not the all-encompassing solution towards fairness in hiring. It can, however, we think, still be a part to trigger that discussion and have then things going on, but how would you see it otherwise? My title was Why AI? Because in all these discussions, and also back in my earlier project, I could imagine a few different potential questions on why we would do this data-driven decision-making in the first place. Maybe to be better than human performance. That did seem the frame that people came to me about. Or would it rather be to make humans better performers? And if so, which of the humans? Are it the raters, the organization, the applicants? Even there, it's quite unclear. And very often, in even discussions today, we're not that articulate on this. Maybe to get more insights into what makes for a good hire. For my organizational psychology colleagues, that was their actual interest. But then still, they framed it to me as doing better than humans, which was not actually the same thing, and I had to discuss it with them too. Maybe to scale up selection, because you can't humanly go through everything. Maybe you do need some filtering mechanisms there. But if you do that, are you only going to go for the most promising candidates that very clearly speak to you? Or would you service those who would otherwise not be found? And that, again, is a slightly different frame to the same problem. Or maybe, should we admit that we as humans are faulty and bad at this, and maybe want for AI to help us reflect on this? Also an aspect that is typically not so much discussed. And I think that's important, because these different motivations will come with different solutions and different success criteria and different types of experiments, if I may frame it like that. Also, practical data availability, that's a real challenge. Like what I said before in hiring, you don't have any info typically on your false negatives. The ones that don't make it, and that could have been good hires. Nobody traces them. So if they all the time cannot make it, that might be a form of unfairness or injustice, and nobody knows. And lots of definitions then go out of the window if you don't have that info. In terms of how good we assume the human to be, huge risks of confirmation bias, even more so today in the age of generative AI. We like seeing what we recognize. We like going for what we recognize. So if you want to not have that, you may, on the interface side, need to purposefully build friction. And there, operationalization, we discussed it already, that's where the details are, where the devil lies. And as said, again, many similar questions and considerations I'd say play today with generative AI at large, ChatGPT in the context of these applications, but even when I speak of risk modeling or how generative AI can help people write their things better, etc., very often I have similar conversations still today. So that's what I wanted to bring up, and happy to still discuss in the time that's left.
Many thanks, Cynthia. So we have, I think, only 8 minutes for questions. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. No, I'm very interested in the paper. Like, where is it going to be featured, or do you have a preprint?
Yeah, so we submitted it to CSCW. That comes with this journal associated to it.
Okay.
So I put a DOI in the slides.
Yeah,
that should be
made
a stable
picture.
reference.
No, thank
yeah,
you.
and it should be the April version of the journal. We had the proofs approved 2 weeks ago, so it should be really soon.
No,
Yeah,
super great research. Like, I wanted to ask you whether you could expand a little bit more on these, that fairness and diversity considerations may not always go hand in hand. I think that I would like to know more about that, or if you have more concrete examples.
Sure. Well, as said, in terms of the issue is if you depart from a situation where there is an imbalance naturally, this links a bit to the discussion on, is the world as we observe now the world as you want to keep or not? And there are a lot of stakeholders that would find it unfair if you decide to modify that, or that would find it out of their responsibility. Some people would find it so. And in terms to increase diversity, if you have this imbalance, you in any case want to do something about it. But then very often people push back and say, no, but that's not fair, because the merit discussion then typically comes. So this is something where I see a lot of tension. It does have some ideological correlations, it seems, to where people stand. But it also does seem to me that institutions, the parties in power, tend to not so much recognize then the diversity consideration, right? Or don't see it as the top priority.
No, No, because it made me remember of a colleague that she's at mathematics in Leiden University, and basically the colleagues also were not recognizing that of a problem. So basically, they want to take some proactive actions, in including like much more female representation in research assistants,
Yes.
and so. And basically, the colleagues were like, "Oh well, but like we want to prime excellence and like excellence in students and so on." No? And they are like sort of like blocked already, like into that moment. And then even then, some other colleagues saying like, "Well, but the gender discussion like moved like so much already in contemporary understanding that now it doesn't make sense to do that." And then it means like to be back like to square zero, like in somehow, so like not doing that. No, very interesting. Like it seems to me that like we do have anyway like the power like to say, well, although perhaps like there's imbalance is natural, like but perhaps like it was natural until now, but like knowing that now the contemporary understanding like have moved forward, perhaps like we could use certain tools in order to compensate it anyway. But well, it just raises the more ask for awareness on the topic. No?
Totally with you. And as you say, I think now the reality of academic promotions in the tech space have a lot of this in terms of indeed, and the people who make these decisions just not recognizing the non-alpha male type of stance into the field, and 100%. Then finding you not excellent enough as a consequence, and finding it fair because they're the experts. So that's in practice. You see it a lot as a pattern. And then there are lots of discussions because this ultimately ties to this individual versus group fairness discussion and what your criterion is, I'd say. Yeah.
Thanks for a great presentation. You wrote the devil is in the operationalization. I would jump on that a bit. Can you imagine that also the angel might be in the operationalization, or if not, I mean, what according to your experience would be the alternative?
No. I mean, it's more like the devil is in the details. How I meant it. So not necessarily in a bad way. There could be angels in operationalization too. I just think that that's the part that is the most tricky and the most critical, and currently has maybe the least diverse discussion. So if we speak again about diversity and fairness, strategically in the high abstract level, people talk about it. Operationally in the math world, people talk about it, and in the middle for the translation, typically people want to toss it over the fence and run away. So I feel that also now it's very much seen as something for the technological person to fix, but with a lot of under-specification on what's exactly meant. So also in this risk modeling space where I've done this public narrative, there's been a lot of, but we want to be fair. Okay, so what does that mean? We don't want to burden people who are innocent with too many checks. Okay, good, but then do you realize you're always checking people who look the same? But that's less people. Okay, good, that's your definition of fairness, then I might not agree with you, but maybe I find something different, fair or unfair, and knowing this, I can't easily get the right equation off the shelf if you don't tell me these things, and I think some people might need to push back in this as well. So that's just where I feel there's a lot more discussion needed, and even there the scoping is really hard. Like it's also about a bit more, I think, than the fairness criterion. It's about how you put the whole pipeline and process in place too, which was discussed before too. And then there typically isn't a very clear owner who is the overseer of it all. So even there, people tend to then put it at legal or data science or somewhere else, but not in the overarching vision that tends to remain on the surface.
I totally agree, thanks.
One more question.
I kind of want to go back to the original sort of thing that you brought up about the, recommendation kind of algorithm focusing your attention one way, and yet there's potentially a whole bunch of relevant stuff that just by the nature of actually the way most machine learning recommendation algorithms would work, important but sort of out of distribution things are missed.
Yeah.
And in your work, how have you sort of grappled with that issue?
Yes. So the hard thing is that I think this at least as much is an interaction challenge as it is a data challenge. And the interaction part is really hard to, again, experimentally control for. So you have a lot of issues there in finding ways to push this forward with what you naturally would have, especially if you are actually a quantitative person. We know interaction data if people were nice enough to share it with us, but you can't really control for more friction, and the parties that have the big infrastructure tend to not want more friction. They want for you just to stay in the platform and keep looking at things that are safe. So here again, I feel the public sector has maybe some way to go about this, but making the argument in the first place to people that they might need something different than what they now immediately go for with confirmation bias, it's really hard to get people there. And even there again, maybe doing more speculative, creative things that get them out of it, I think there might be something in there. But that won't be recognized as academic achievement in the machine learning context. So even here, it's different places that you are at. And that's, I think, also a big challenge, that this is really transdisciplinary, and you have to somehow get the critical mass to move that forward. I did this also with libraries, and frankly, I think the most effective intervention was someone locally who would put a table there and just put some books there and say, I think you should read this. No algorithm would beat that. So this is what I think we need to somehow get bigger overview of, and then be able to consolidate together. Thank you.
Yeah, many thanks.